Oh men now, you two, Nigel, don't touch her. Leave her to the doctor. Cicely's mind tried to piece together the familiar sounds that she was hearing. She knew she recognized them, but from where? He's busy with the wounded, James. She could feel cold hands on her brow now, and the sun. Definitely the sun drying her clothes. Her clothes. Cicely opened her eyes to see Joseph Nigel patting her face. "Welcome back to the land of the living," he said quietly. "No need to move," he added as she tried to sit up. She began, then coughed. "Here," said James, coming closer to her and slipping his jerkin off. Nigel gave him a look, before relenting and allowing James to roll it up and put it under her head. "Fotherington," she managed, looking up at James. "Your father." James shook his head. "Not my father," he said quietly. "The man who the doctor shot was a spy for Bonaparte. My father would never do such a thing." He took her hand and held it, but Cicely struggled to sit up, looking at him urgently. "But Stephen," she began, looking at James, before realizing his confusion. "The doctor," she confirmed. "He must have known all about Fotherington." Nigel smiled. "Looks like we have our own spy," said Nigel, taking her other hand and with a glance at James, pulled Cicely to her feet. "Come on," he said cheerfully. "We won." Cicely looked round at the scene of dreadful devastation. Mutilated bodies of dead French and English sailors bestrewed the deck, their faces fixed in masks of terror. Then bells began to ring aboard the Acheron. Aubrey's men, Cicely included, stood on the foredeck together as the captain announced their triumph. "Hutzer!" cried the men around them. "Hutzer!" Cicely looked around at the men, throwing off their black armbands in triumph, as they cheered. Edward was now at peace, Cicely knew, and smiled at James, who hugged he in celebration. "3 cheers for Captain Pullings," announced Aubrey as the men continued to cheer. "Hutzer!" And it was then that Cicely, as she caught Maturin's glance briefly during the cheer, realized that although the day was won, Hutzer, and she had fought hard and cleared her brother's name, Hutzer, she now belonged anywhere but aboard a ship. 88,888,888. Cicely awoke in her hammock the day after the battle, happy that she knew now what she must do. The day before, despite fervent insistence from many of them to the contrary, she helped the crew clear away the dead, both French and English, from the deck of the Acheron, and their own injured back to the Surprise. The French dead they had left for the most senior officer of the now Navy-owned Acheron, who happened to be a 17-year-old midshipman. The English, whose number included Calumet, Dowdall, Wiggin, Nash, Taylor, Old Joe, and Chell, were honored by a Christian burial at sea from the Surprise. Cicely had stood there, once their decks were clear that evening, listening to the names of those killed being solemnly recited by the captain following their shrouding. Tears had flowed from her eyes unashamedly as she stood shoulder to shoulder, next to James and also to Fitzherbert, an able seaman whom she had helped gratefully back onto the Surprise. Celebrations commenced thereafter, and well into the night. The captain declared double grog rations for all, and that the anchor would be weighed and all duties were suspended until the next morning. The men sat at decks, making merry, dancing and drinking, singing of what seemed like every shanty, jig and reel known to them all, and laughing about their victory that day. Cicely had sat and listened. Already their feats were passing into legend. The day when Jack Aubrey won the greatest Pacific victory, over the Acheron, for the crown. When the enemy outnumbered the heroes, which made them more determined to fight and win. When the doctor, to whom they toasted as he, the officers and captain visited them following their own celebratory supper, killed the spy and saved the captain, and therefore the day. Cicely had sat and listened to it all, even when James nudged her trying to gain her rebuttal of the facts, but she shushed him, trying not to make eye contact with Maturin. It was only when Richards picked up his concertina, striking up the Scotsman's Fair Maiden, and Nigel had pulled her into the center of the group with the other men to dance, that the look Maturin gave her before the officers left was one so strange that Cicely could not figure its meaning. However, Cicely did not have a chance to reflect on it until Blakeney had woken her up early the next morning sobbing into the men's berth where, it turned out, Maturin had told him she would be found. She'd sat at decks with the lad comforting him and reassuring him that Peter, his best friend aboard, would be in heaven now. Will asked her whether Edward would have forgiven them all, and Cicely had said, of the kind brother she had known, there was no doubt. She held him close in her arms for comfort when he dissolved into tears, stroking his hair and remaining silent when Blakeney had soothed himself quietly by reminding himself she would still be there. And once Blakeney had returned, now pacified, to his bed, Cicely remained above looking out into the darkness, and reflecting on her situation. Despite her knowing deep down that her brother was at peace, Cicely still realized that her time upon this ship was past. The men treated her as one of their own. She was still Robert Young to them, their Minlad, and accordingly she'd fought to work and live with them. But what of the brutality she had witnessed, and committed? That was almost unbearable. Even though she had done it for Edward and, in the end, for her captain. Worse still, she had made a grave mistake in marrying the doctor, for though he had helped her, she was in no position to repay the debt. His position aboard was far too complex for her to be a consideration, of course. That list of names, about which she had told no one, was clearly connected with counterintelligence for the Crown. She could not let herself get in the way of that, and were she to mention her wish to stay aboard, he would surely accommodate, such the gentleman he was. Not even his manly beauty she would allow to sway her. And what would God's punishment be for her treating marriage so nonchalantly? With the decision to depart in some way in her mind that morning, and seemingly boundless energy as a result, Cicely made her way to the sick berth. In every available space men hung in hammocks, mostly slung from the beams, and where there was no space, others slept on the floor, broken and wounded limbs laid out to ease their pain. Many of them turned as she closed the door behind her. "Morning," she said in general, walking over to the window side of the berth. "P.E.," she said quietly. "How are you?" The young boy grinned up out of a filthy face, his blonde curls flat against his head. He lifted his left leg in her direction, indicating where the lower part had been amputated that morning. Cicely stroked the boy's head. In another hour he'd feel it. "Who closed this door?" "I instructed for it to remain open." Cicely stopped when she heard Maturin's authoritative tone. There were murmurs amongst the men, and Cicely carried on looking at P for another couple of seconds before turning. "Cicely," he continued, noticing her there. "Don't say anything, kindly," she begged him silently. "Please. And how do you fare, after your plunge into the great blue?" He smiled, and gestured towards her back. "I would be happier if you would allow me to examine you." She shook her head. "You are most kind, Doctor," Cicely replied, realizing that many of the eyes in the busy berth had stopped to look at them. "But I'm well. And besides, I would rather make myself of use to you in whatever way I can. Lieutenant Pullings has stood me down for a shift to recuperate." "And so you should. In bed," replied Maturin evenly. "That'll be Captain Pullings," replied Captain Pullings, interrupting them. "However, I do feel you need some assistance, Doctor, in order for your own wounds to heal," he continued. Cicely looked down to his leg where bandages were holding it together. "It's nothing," he said, following her stare. "It's a 3-inch deep and 10-inch wide gash from a second lieutenant, Young," clarified Pullings, grinning. "And it might have been worse if I hadn't been behind you." Maturin shot him a look. Pullings continued to grin. "Perhaps you would like to start with Captain Pullings," said Maturin. "He is in need of rebandaging and redressing." He is also taking a up hammock which I need for Rawlings, so I would be grateful if you could treat him a Dex. Cicely nodded as Pullings screwed up his face in obvious defeat. Once they were outside, Cicely sat next to Captain Thomas Pullings, RN, and carefully rolled up his sleeve, trying not to catch any of the dressing in it. She then crossed over to Mount, who was minning, requesting her ration of grog. At least it would be cleaner than the water aboard, having been distilled at least once. "What a waste," commented Pullings as she began to unravel the cotton he had wrapped round the wound. "Rather think I should drink that to numb the pain." "So when will you be sailing?" asked Cicely, ignoring his request and pouring the alcohol onto clean padding before wiping it over the star-shaped gash on his forearm. Pullings winced, but tried not to let it show. "I'll be captaining the Acheron back to Portsmouth this very afternoon," he replied. "Killick's going to choose half a dozen men to go with me so I can crew her properly, and I'll take half of the Marines. We'll have to refit in Neodora, of course, so she will get home in one piece. And I'll probably have to retrain a carpenter. Captain Aubrey won't be able to spare his." "She's a fair prize," said Cicely, blotting away the liquid and glancing at the Acheron's mainsail just behind them. "I expect it will be a sadness for you to leave the Surprise. How long have you known the captain?" "More years than I care to remember," replied Tom, laughing heartily. "I was a midshipman not much older than Mr. Blakeney when I first met Lucky Jack. He was a lieutenant then, of the Sophie. My, we've had some times." He looked wistful, and Cicely continued to bandage the clean wound. "I will miss her," continued, patting the timber of the Surprise. "We've seen some action, certainly." "As have you." Pullings looked sideways at Cicely, who tied off her bandage and stepped back. She nodded in agreement. "You're quite right, Captain Pullings," Cicely conceded. "As you were right then, when you spoke to me 2 days ago." She sat down next to him on the deck. "You did what you thought was best. For your brother. This I can understand that. Sometimes family concerns are the most important thing." He smiled in her direction, an empathetic smile which if she were another of her sex, Cicely was sure she would find endearing. "He's at peace," she nodded, confirming the new captain's unspoken words. "He wasn't one to hold on to conflict. And now I know more surely than I have ever done that I am in the wrong situation. After yesterday. After." Cicely stopped and turned to him, looking into Pulling's brilliant blue eyes. "You are of the new century, Captain Pullings," she continued candidly. "And now I see your point of view. There was no place for me in the battle yesterday. I hindered Captain Aubrey. More men may have survived, and for that I will always be truly sorry." Pullings held out his left hand and patted her own as she looked away. "Far from it," replied Tom Pullings sharply. "I never have witnessed a woman in battle, and I believe Jack thought you would get into it far deeper than you could handle and expect to be rescued when things got tough. But you far exceeded all our expectations," he finished, not allowing Cicely to interrupt. "You did remarkably well, Cicely. And for the men to treat you as one of their own, that's proof enough." Cicely looked at him as he spoke. Of all the crew aboard, Pullings had been always come across to her as the least affable. She could see his strength now of a naval captain, and in time his reason and determination would make him loved in his stead, like Lucky Jack. "You are clearly able to carry out a mizzen shift over a sustained period of time, that is certain. And I don't think you would have been discovered had it not for Will Blakeney." Pullings smiled, but then frowned as he noticed a shadow fall across her face. "Fotherington would have killed the captain if you hadn't been aboard. The doctor would not have got there in time, I should know. We officers were instructed to relieve him of combat where we could. I tried, but it took us both to finish off the stubborn Frenchie, and by the time he was free it would have been too late." Cicely smiled. "Thank you," she said, getting up. However, it matter not where my strength and personal character lies, on balance I should not have been there. Looking around her, she took in the men who had been well enough to take the shift following the battle, her own, for a time. She took in the quarterdeck, where Blakeney was directing the watch, and the sick berth whose open door revealed Stephen Maturin, doctor, naturalist and intelligence agent attending the first of these duties. "I should not be here now," she said quietly, before turning back to Pullings. He stood himself and clapped Cicely on the shoulder. "I've always need of a lad who can mizzen like you, Cicely," he said reassuringly. "Especially one who can nurse so expertly." He held up his arm in approval. "I don't believe you would tolerate my presence aboard your own ship," said Cicely slowly, not quite daring to believe that her resolve could be met so easily. "I would be cumbersome to you, a nuisance." "You tolerated the situation here." "Because I had to. For Edward. I was foolhardy." "But you proved it could be done," Pullings said approvingly. "That goes a long way. You overcame your fear with courage, something which many could not." Cicely stepped away from Tom and looked out towards the ocean again. Ahead of them the Galapagos Islands hovered in the haze of the late morning sun. Pullings smiled. "I leave this afternoon, returning to England with Acheron. Will Robert Young be amongst my crew?" Cicely turned to look at Pullings. The last piece of the jigsaw had just fallen into place. She saluted. "Aye, sir. 88,888,888. Following the end of the morning half-watch, William Blakeney should have been returning to his bunk instead of creeping past the cookhouse. He should have headed left, down to the officer's berth, rather than right into the mess. And he certainly should not be following the voices he could hear above him. However, the start of the conversation he had picked up 10 minutes ago had bothered him, so much so that he had crawled into the space at the back of the storage shelves, a secret passed on to him by the instigator of the exchange himself. Will squeezed between the top of the storage planks and the floor above, thanking fortune that he was still small enough to fit into his space. "If she indeed leaves with you, Tom, I cannot pretend to be sorry for it. I believe it a highly sensible course of action for Miss Holland to take." Blakeney had only just caught part of the captain's dialogue and shuffled round to gain a more advantageous position. "Sir," he heard Pullings reply, "I have already broached Cicely on the subject and she had agreed. In her capacity as Robert Young she will mizzen the Acheron until we reach Portsmouth." "And then what?" Above Blakeney, he heard the doctor move. "She has not informed me of such situation." "I do beg your pardon, sir," Pullings replied. "Of course, your wife has expressed the wish to mizzen under my order aboard the commandeered Acheron and dash. She does not need my consent. She does not need my consent, Jack. Have I not already explained myself to that effect?" There was silence, and indistinct voices before Maturin continued, "Excuse me, Captain Pullings. I need to speak to Captain Aubrey alone." Blakeney shuffled back, rubbing the back of his neck that was becoming twisted between the floor and ceiling. Cicely was to leave? A pang of worry washed over him before he shuffled forward to listen again. If she leaves, what will become of her? Stephen paced back and forth along the floor above Blakeney. She will not survive long alone. With her brother gone, how will she live? It is surely her decision, Stephen, as you have made clear, replied Jack Aubrey, turning to look at his friend who was so obviously uneasy with the situation. She will have considered it, surely? She will have considered it, said Stephen, annoyed. And as her husband, I will offer her board, and she will refuse it? Then she will insist that the marriage is annulled in order that I do not to insult her again. And when she falls on hard times, and cannot live, she will bear it, and will probably decide that Robert Young needs to enlist in the Navy again. You have spoken to her on the matter, then? Stephen shot his friend a look. You mock me, sir, he replied bitterly. She has passed nothing of intimacy to me since before the battle, as well you know. Then how dash? Because that is how it is. Maturin banged his fist angrily on the oak paneling by the door. Is it only I that can see that? Jack looked at the emotion in his face. He had seen such passion before in his friend, but it had been confined to the care of his men and to the natural world. At length, he continued. You have feelings of affection for the woman? Certainly not. I care for her, if that's what you mean. And if she were to remain, I have work for her to do, plenty to aid the running of the ship. She is making good progress tending the wounded, and she herself has healed remarkably well. Stephen walked over to Aubrey's desk and looked at objects upon it. A Mercator map of the west coast of Ecuador, a sextant, various naval journals and logs. And when my crew are mended. When your work is complete. In the eyes of the law she is your property, and as such, now I have allowed her to fight in Holam's name, I will not tolerate her as Robert Young. Will she not do as a wife? Is she not coercible? Aubrey looked in all seriousness at the doctor. I would not be so audacious, declared Stephen, folding his arms, annoyed. I have considered her a free woman since the moment you wed us. Despite my better judgment, I overlook her nightly disappearances to the crew decks because, Aubrey raised his eyebrows in astonishment. Oh, don't look like that. You trust your crew. She is clearly more comfortable though with Fillings and the others than with me. He paced round to the other side of the table and sat back down in his Queen Anne chair. Jack exhaled slowly. Something didn't quite add up. I don't understand your logic, Stephen. You can command her as you wish, and yet you allow her free will. And when she chooses to exercise it in a clear and sensible manner, you wish her to stay because you fear she will perish alone. Do you not agree that by her very presence that she is clearly capable of her own care? Jack sighed, and placed both hands on the desk. Where is she, anyway? I sent her to collect bandages and medication from my cabin, sighed Stephen, holding his head in his hands. He looked up. My friend, I will allow her to stay, should you so wish. Maturin shot him a look of hope as Jack looked out onto the main. She may, he continued. However, her work for me will cease and she must be declared openly to be your wife. Whatever you command of her is in your judgment and I will respect that. Maturin got to his feet. Then you will permit me leave to find my wife and wish her good fortune under Captain Pullings. Stephen placed an unsteady hand on the handle and went to turn it. Stephen? Jack followed his reach to the handle and looked at his friend's face, sorrow edging onto it. I beg of you to explain. Surely this compromise suits both our needs. Maturin took his hand off the handle. She insisted Higgins treat my wounds, Jack. She barely looks at me. I believe she has regretted her decision of marriage and cannot bear to be in my presence. He looked to the floor, before glancing at his friend. And despite this, you still wish her to remain? You wish, I think, for a situation which does not yet exist. Do you still insist you do not have feelings for Cicely? If you'll excuse me, Maturin repeated, opening the door with a creak. Blakeney wriggled out of the gap and down onto the cookhouse floor. Above, he heard the door of the captain's cabin creak closed and the doctor pace out onto the deck above. He saw Maturin run his hand over his hair and stepping in the direction of the sick berth. Blakeney ducked underneath the staircase as he saw Stephen pass, before watching as he misstepped and turning, pacing in the other direction, towards his own cabin. Keeping 6 feet behind the doctor, Blakeney followed him across the first deck, dipping into the shadows as the doctor paused sporadically, as if inside fighting an urge to turn back. Eventually Maturin reached his cabin, and placed a hand on the already open door as if to push it further open. Blakeney took another step as if to follow him, but pulled it back as the doctor retreated, looking over his shoulder. And then, a scene justifying Blakeney's actions that were to come that afternoon, came to pass. The doctor peered round the door, watching Cicely within. From his position near the wall, Will could see Cicely. She was sitting at Maturin's desk, with the bandages she was bade to fetch before her. Gently, she was looking at his large notebook in which he sketched and hand-illustrated the wonderful animals he had discovered on Albemarle and Chatham, outlining them lightly with her finger. Then she got to her feet and picked up the dress in which she had wed, holding it against her. "Go in, sir," he willed. "Tell her." Maturin took a few steps towards Cicely, making her jump. He took the dress from her carefully. She looked in his direction, and from what Will could see, she was talking to him about the crew, gesturing in the vicinity of the sick berth. The doctor had taken the bandages from her, and the dress he hung as it appeared she was requesting behind the door. "Tell her." He saw a few more words of conversation pass. Will knew she was informing him of her wish to leave and he was wishing her well. This was further confirmed to the boy when he saw the doctor go to kiss Cicely on her lips, but she turned so he caught only her cheek. "Why won't you tell her?" he yelled silently to the couple, as Maturin stepped back through the door. "And why won't you tell him?" Shrinking back against the wall, Blakeney waited until the doctor had passed and could hear him climbing the steps to the upper deck before he looked back in her direction. Cicely had seated herself back the desk and was continuing to look at the books. "Will!" she exclaimed, looking up in surprise when she noticed him standing there. "How are you all right?" she said, when she saw his expression. "I've come to say," he began, before walking over to the doctor's bed and sitting down on it, holding his head in his hands. He stopped, looking beseechingly at Cicely. She crossed the cabin and knelt before Blakeney, who was shaking. "I've come to say that there's going to be a feast," he said, "a celebration before Captain Pullings sails the Acheron." "That's good news," said Cicely, comfortingly, then rubbed his arm as tears began to flow. "And I expect Peter would have enjoyed it," she ventured soothingly. He looked at her sharply. "Yes," he said. "And Tom," he added, before wiping away another tear. "Cicely, is it right what Tom told Captain Aubrey? That you're going to mizzen on the Acheron?" She nodded, and rubbed his shoulder. So that was it. Cicely knew he had a soft spot for her, but didn't quite realize how much he cared for her. And now, come to think of it, how much she would miss his bright, happy-go-lucky face, keen and eager to become an officer, proudly and valiantly commanding the ship to victory in the battle. "Captain Aubrey has left me battle for Edward," she said softly. "He will not allow me to stay aboard now, and here is my ideal opportunity to continue in his service while I decide what to do next." Will looked at her, confused. "Why can you not stay? You work well as a mizzen, and Captain Aubrey has no reason to complain of your work." Cicely laughed. "I'm afraid he does. What about my tendency to fight with other men when I disagree with them? And my insubordination? No, even if I were Robert Young, a boy," she added, when he looked at her doubtfully, "and as I'm not, he is far too decent to allow me to be Cicely Holm." "But, don't you care for the doctor anymore?" Blakeney got to his feet, standing over Cicely. "Don't you remember telling me how you adored him? How you loved him?" Cicely looked back in shock, getting to her feet and moving over to the window of the doctor's cabin, by his hammock. By his spare set of spectacles marking the pages of Erasmus Darwin's Zoonomia. "You do," he continued reproachfully, "I know you do. You loved him when he was ill, dying, you loved him when you married him, and you love him still." "Stop it," Cicely said sharply, turning from the window and making Blakeney jump. "Yes," she confessed quietly, approaching him gently. I do love him, and always will. Which is why I can dishonor him no longer and must leave the ship." Stepping towards Will, she pulled the dress from the back of the cabin door and folded it over her arm and walked past him. "But I love you," he called after her, beginning to sob. Cicely stopped dead, dropping the dress onto the floor and hurried back to him. Hugging him tightly, she rubbed his back comfortingly. "And are you, Will? I'll never forget you. But your destiny lies on another path to mine." Cicely pulled him back and looked him in the eye. "When I read about Admiral Blakeney in the Times," she continued, wiping a tear from his cheek with his thumb, "and his glorious victory over the French, I'll remember you, Will." "But I heard the doctor and the captain talking," replied Will, "just now," he added, swallowing. "The doctor wants you to stay. He saw how well you treated Tom." Cicely shook her head and smiled. "He wants me to stay?" "Mr. Blakeney," she turned, but Will stood in front of her. "Please excuse me, I'm to see the captain and return this." She gestured to the beautiful dress lying crumpled on the floor. "You can't leave," he cried, looking at her angrily. "I'll never see you again." "Will," she said calmly, trying to contain her emotions. "What use would I be aboard a working battleship? Yes, I could nurse, and I could educate. When you're older, Will, you'll understand. But my failing," she quavered, her heart stinging as she spoke to the boy, "is that I am a woman, Will. Despite myself, I love him. With every fiber of my soul. And if I remain, I will be tormented because I know he could never love me back. That, rather than a gunshot, or a cannon, or sickness," she held his shoulders, "will hurt me, will kill me." She put her hand to her chest. "Here. I'm leaving Will because I will not be able to bear that." "But he heard you," he exclaimed. "When you were ill. He heard you tell him you loved him. And you told me about how you were lost in his green eyes." Cicely smiled, gently. "He didn't understand. How could he? He was only 13 and besides her and his mother, he had never been in the company of females." "I'll never forget your keeping of my promise," she said, kissing him on the cheek before getting to her feet. "I'll miss you." Cicely turned and, picking up the dress, walked hastily towards the steps. The hardest thing will be telling James, she thought, as she began to climb the steps. He'd been through a lot. But from what she'd heard he was ripe for promotion. Now he was stronger. "Cicely." She heard Blakeney call after her. When she got to the deck she stopped and waited for him to catch her up. "Good luck, Will," she said, smoothing down his hair. "I'll miss you, Cicely," he replied, smiling. "We won't ever have a Millard as good as you." Cicely turned and began to walk without turning to look at Will. She rapped on the door of the captain's cabin. 88,888,888. "I understand that you have accepted the offer from Mr. Pullings to return to Portsmouth, meaning the Acheron?" Cicely nodded as the captain spoke. "If I may say, a wise decision. Your husband has agreed, of course. Before I leave, please accept this." Cicely held out the dress in which she had been wed. Aubrey frowned and shook his head. "No," he said. "Sophie has too many dresses. You may keep it. And besides, it was your wedding dress." Cicely stopped, and looked back at the captain, still holding it aloft. "I don't think I'll be needing it for minning," she said slowly. Jack watched as she draped it over the back of the Queen Anne chair. "No doubt you'll make a good job of it, I'm sure. I must thank you for your work tending my sick men. Dr. Matrin informs me that even he could not have made as good a job with Captain Pullings as you did yourself." He looked up from his desk and looked at Cicely in her tunic that she had found time to repair herself, lengthening hair and boy's breeches, before turning and surveying the ocean. "I do have another offer for you to consider, a promotion from Millard to nurse. Now I do not make this offer lightly, but it is not every day that a Millard uncovers the identity of an enemy spy and saves her captain's life." Cicely smiled with pride, despite herself. "I think it is wise for me to leave, sir," she said slowly. "You've done more than enough for me. I wish to alleviate you both of your responsibilities." Jack turned, and looked at her carefully. What will you do when you return to England? Find work, said Cicely. My father believes me to be dead. I cannot contemplate what he will do if he finds I am alive. A trade, I expect. Robert Young could become apprenticed, at least. And you wouldn't consider staying to assist your husband? Jack sat down in his chair, and noticed her flinch. I could not tolerate your residency nights with the men, of course, and you must declare your status as the doctor's wife. However, this may be preferable than chancing your luck back in England. It was an honourable thing he did in marrying me, sir, Cicely replied, shaking her head. If I were to remain, I don't believe I could bring him anything but shame. Aubrey looked at her for qualification. I do not love him, she confirmed. There. She had declared it. She did not love Stephen Maturin. Aubrey got to his feet. Then it's agreed, Miss Holm, he said, smiling as he extended a hand. I release you from my service and wish you well. Cicely returned the smile and shook his hand. Captain Pullings leaves at mid-afternoon. A celebratory feast is prepared. Collect your belongings together and report to the mess. Yes, sir, she said, then saluted, before opening the door. Stepping out, Cicely turned to the right, and headed down to the berths. Jack sat back down to his desk and picked up his quill. He looked at the orders he had nearly finished writing for Tom, adding Robert Young to the list of crew departing the Surprise. Just then, there was a knock on the door. Come. Sir. Ah, Mr. Blakeney? What may I do for you? Aubrey put down his quill and looked at the boy, who appeared agitated. There's something important you need to know, Captain Dash. 88,888,888. Following the feast, where the men and officers had dined together, Cicely descended to the berth and said her goodbyes to the crew. The first person she told had been her bear. James had patted her on the back a few times, and had taken it better than she had expected, or at least better than she would have done, Cicely had thought, if she had been losing him. Before she turned to farewell the others, he had pressed into her hand a pocket watch, explaining that it had been his grandfather's when Cicely had tried to refuse. The look James had given her was one of such hurt that she had taken it and fastened the chain to the buttonhole on her tunic, so the face glimmered in the candlelight. Ah, said Nigel, clapping her on the back. It's good to see you go, he said, grinning at her. Good? Said James, looking horrified. Ah, he confirmed, clapping James on the back. Leaves more Frenchies for the rest of us next time. Cicely turned to Nigel, who put something in her hands. For Mrs. Whalley. Just wanted her to know about Will. That he died honourably for us, he said. Cicely nodded, recalling the stormy cold night that the mainmast was lost and Whalley lost with it. Cicely then looked across at the other men, Wade, Finch and Hoole, plus others beside, all clutching parchment, letters for their loved ones, no doubt. Once she had stowed them into her Hessian roll, Cicely made her way up to the deck, and stood with the other men who were to depart with the Acheron under Captain Pullings. They saluted Captain Aubrey, who was overseeing their departure from the Surprise, and Killick began to pipe their departure. Cicely glanced along the faces of the officers on the quarter-deck. Captain Aubrey, newly promoted First Lieutenant Mallet and Midshipman Heald and Donna. Behind them, she could see the figure of Stephen Maturin, in the same dress coat he wore when they had been married. Don't look, she told herself as she saluted and turned with the others, facing the back of Fitzherbert. Just as Killick piped the last note, she stepped forward, and onto the kick plank. Cicely. She turned to see Will before her. Didn't you speak to the captain? Cicely glanced up at Aubrey, whose face had turned stormier at Blakeney's breaking with protocol. Yes, Will, she whispered, holding out a hand. You know my decision. Goodbye, she added. Will shook her hand, looking over his shoulder and glancing at the captain. Cicely turned to go again, but Will held her onto her hand. "Will," she interjected, aware that the men were watching her intently. "Mr. Blakeney, do not delay that man in his duty," Aubrey commanded from the quarter-deck, before stepping down to the foredeck. "But sir," Will shouted, then stopped, turning to Cicely. "You must stay," he insisted, looking at her earnestly. "Will." "But you love him." Cicely felt a murmur ripple through the assembled men as Blakeney broke her trust loudly. "Will," she said, ignoring his last comment, "I cannot nurse here, I'm a far better mizzen. And you are quite wrong." She glanced up at Aubrey, who had appeared behind Blakeney. "There is nothing between the doctor and myself." She shook her hand free. "And he loves you," Blakeney shouted. Cicely looked around before crouching to his level, a tear welling in her eye. She lowered her voice to a whisper. "You are wrong, Mr. Blakeney, sir. He cannot love me, for I am a millard under Captain Pullings of the Acheron. Had circumstances been different, I would gladly nurse under Captain Aubrey, of the Surprise. And you would do well to remember it," she scolded herself. Robert Young?" Cicely got to her feet again, and looked at Aubrey. But it was clear it wasn't the captain who had spoken. And from behind him, Dr. Stephen Matrin stepped forward, and stood before her. "I accept the appointment of Mrs. Cicely Matrin to nurse aboard the Surprise under my direction, and wish to tell her." He paused, but did not break his gaze, "that she is wrong in her assumption of my affection." Matrin stepped towards her, and held out a hand for her to step down back onto the deck of the Surprise. The world spinning about her, Cicely took it. "How could I not love you, Cicely Holm?" he asked quietly, pulling her into his arms. "You are brave, selfless, beautiful." Cicely looked down, but Stephen picked up her chin and she shivered as he looked into her eyes, his own dazzling bright. "It is also quite alarming, your ability to handle a blade. I shall be in fear of my position as surgeon aboard this ship." Stephen stroked his hand across her back. "Cicely," said Will, quickly, but Jack Aubrey hushed him into silence. Looking once more into her eyes, Stephen Matrin caught her in his arms, and pressed his mouth to hers. The world around Cicely melted away to leave just them both, together. 3 cheers for the doctor. 3 cheers for Robert Young. Hutser. 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 88,888,888. One of these days I should pen the music to an air, thought Cicely, as she heard the ship's doctor and captain tune their strings. Maybe an aria, a change from Mozart and Handel at least. Cicely looked at James, newly promoted to able seaman, being shown the ropes by Nigel, and Will Blakeney at the prow teaching the middies the sextant. She waved as Blakeney saw her, before guiding Daniel Richards' eye to the level of the mid-morning sun. On second thoughts, it was their time. Their friendship had endured despite Jack Aubrey's reservations. Their difference united harmoniously when they spent time together. Stephen came back from their evenings spent together enlivened and invigorated with a different eye for his work. Cicely sighed and looked across the foredeck as a couple of the new millards step out onto the deck, bucket in hand. It should be her teaching them, she was as able as Frobisher. However, following the drama of recapturing the Acheron almost 2 months ago and her own domestic insurgency, Cicely had noticed the captain was becoming more liberal with respect to her status amongst his crew, and at a turn, Stephen more conservative, even chiding her for allowing the crew to speak informally to her. Cicely had pointed out that, as a free woman, she was at liberty to put herself forward for Millard again, to which Jack, much to Stephen's annoyance, had stated that, as the best Millard on the high seas, Robert Young would be more than welcome as part of the Surprise's crew. "Shall I go on to the next page, Cissy?" asked P.E., looking at her earnestly. Her self-extension to teaching the men to read had brought acclaim from both men, for which Cicely had been happy, She didn't think she could tolerate only the role of nurse to the men. Bringing enlightenment through literacy was enough to keep her amply busy. She had overheard her husband comment to Aubrey. However, Cicely was aware that Stephen Maturin knew her far better than she cared to admit, and as such, there were some unspoken lines over which she hadn't crossed, including visiting her old shipmates below. Cicely turned over the ship's Bible to the story of Jacob, pointing to the verse from where P should begin. Now the surprise was traveling back from Ecuador to the Galapagos Islands, where she and Stephen would disembark until Aubrey's business in Singapore was concluded. The Doctor had work to do, to uncover the secrets hidden in plain view upon these islands. But there were other secrets too, ones bigger than these islands and the natural pursuits involved in discovering them held, bigger still than her gender. Cicely stroked her stomach lightly through the blue Chinese silk of the unwieldy dress as the tall mountains of Rodondo Rock loomed on the horizon. If it's a boy, Edward, she thought, before turning and watching Maturin return to his work that he had left laid out on the other side of the deck, lost in thought. That was clearly red, said Cicely, bending her knees to P's level, watching him go as the lad grinned happily at the praise. She turned the pages of the Bible to the Book of Judges, chapter 3, verse 1, then sat Cicely cross-legged on the deck. P sat next to her and she began to point out the words as he read aloud, thinking about her life, and Edward, and the future. Every cloud has a silver lining,